Dr. Paul Elovitz is past president of the International Psychohistorical Association. He was a co-founder of our organization. He has founded and organized the Psychohistory Forum for over 30 years, and is the founder and editor of Clio Psyche. Paul is one of the original faculty members at Ramapo College, where he currently teaches. Since 1976, he has written psychohistorical accounts of every presidential election. He has also attended every single conference of the International Psychohistorical Association since its founding. He is eminently qualified to speak on the future of psychohistory.
Thank you.
I'll give you this when you have 5 minutes, okay?
Thank you. At all those meetings, I've given 1 to 3 presentations since our first meeting 39 years ago. This is the first time I'm coming with laryngitis for my allergies, so please let me know if I have to speak closer to the microphone. And Sheldon Solomon is a hard act to follow. I loved his combination of knowledge and humor and not relying on the paper. That's not me. The next agenda of psychohistory, reflections on how people and society change. Originally, when I submitted my presentation proposals for psychohistory's next assignment, for its future, I had in mind a detailed discussion of the following issues, and I call to arms to my colleagues to join in the endeavor. Those issues are the complex processes and ambivalence in which in the acceptance of minorities and women as equals and even as leaders. 2, changing genders in America. People are literally doing it. It's not just unisex anymore. An exploration of celebrity culture and its impact. TV and digital communication as object relations. Our emotional attachment to fantasy. The impact of digital communication on our youth and our world. Individualism, dependency, and interdependency in the family, politics, and society. Images and the psychology of enemies and hatred through the ages. The contemporary American fascination with other animals. Anti-government fantasies and civilization. Global and species consciousness among the internet generation. Steps towards renunciation of genocide, killing, and war. These are very important subjects since they relate to the future of human beings in our complex, ever-changing, and dangerous society. They're well worth pursuing. However, when I actually sat down to write my paper, I found myself focusing on a much more limited group of subjects, some of which I will cover below, and others you can read about in the symposium, which if I sent out to my colleagues and sent to you if you'd like to write a commentary. The symposium on how people and society changes. These are the type of subjects we love to publish in our 23-year-old journal, Clio Psyche, which the Psychohistory Forum is sponsors. One of psychohistory's greatest challenges, ideals and slavery, is the first section. One of psychohistory's greatest challenges is to explain the enormously rapid transformation of attitudes, behavior, and law on a variety of subjects, including children, democracy, homosexuality, human individual rights, slavery, tolerance, women's rights. Some of the agents facilitating change that I probe in no particular order include empathy, ideas, some which become ideals, improved childhood, intergeneration, rebelliousness, and technology. The struggle to change was and is familial and intrapsychic as well as societal. So, how people and societies change, the essential question. Does the idea of change come first, or is the change itself come and then the idea follows? A prime example of the power of ideals, the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights that Eleanor Roosevelt is holding up, a Spanish edition of the listing it. At the time of this declaration, there were few actual democracies in the world in which citizens had individual and group rights. Today, most countries at least have the trimmings of democracy, which include granting individual and political rights, including the secret ballot. Of course, only about 15% of the world have effective democracies in the sense that what Americans would call true democracy, where you can really express your ideas. Furthermore, when this idea was put forth by a committee headed by Eleanor Roosevelt, the leading democracy of the United States had legal segregation and laws against miscegenation. Traditional slavery was still legal in Saudi Arabia and Yemen until 1974. Of course, laws must be enforced as well as passed. And in many parts of the world, there's still de facto slavery, but not legal slavery. Now, during the latter years of enlightenment of the 18th century, the idea of abolishing legal slavery flourished in Western Europe. The idea of treating some humans as property was questioned in the age of reason. Excuse my laryngitis. It sounds as bad to you as it does to me. I feel sorry for your ears.
You sound like your godfather.
Please get that, kid. Large numbers of pamphlets were written denouncing the practice, some by former slaves, such as Lada Equiano, who was also a slave himself at one point. People were beginning to see slaves as human beings, not just as property. There was slavery in all of the 13 colonies that rebelled against Parliament, and the king that. But the idea of it being morally wrong was already beginning to take headway among Quakers and some intellectuals. Benjamin Franklin, one of my childhood heroes, owned at least 7 slaves and published advertisements for the sale of slaves and the capture of runaways. Simultaneously, however, he also was publishing Quaker pamphlets denouncing slavery and was privately questioning the institution. Eventually, he became a critic of the plantation system of slavery and a cautious abolitionist. His thinking was influenced by traveling in England, where there were many people questioning the institution. Now, importantly, the rhetoric of freedom involved the denunciation of slavery. Indeed, Thomas Jefferson wanted to include that specifically, that the colonists were being enslaved by the Brits in the Declaration of Independence. Cooler minds such as Ben Franklin dissuaded him, since they as rebels who owned slaves in so many cases were in a morally dubious position regarding America's own peculiar institution, that is slavery. By 1770, Franklin attacked the international slave trade and the plantation system of slavery and freed his own slaves. However, during the 1787 Constitutional Convention, he would not publicly debate the divisive issue of slavery and tended to equivocate on the whole issue. The founding fathers would constitutionally renounce indentured servitude, which typically meant 4 to 7 years of labor in exchange for transport from England, but not slavery of the other, that is, blacks and Native Americans. Of course, by that point, there weren't too many indentured servants. but there were a lot of slaves, especially in the South. The ideal of freedom for all, renunciation of slavery, ran up against the vested interest of the colonists' possession of slaves as property. The acceptance of slavery as a necessary condition of forming a single American nation rather than a southern slavocracy and a separate northern free society was, in a sense, the original sin of the American nation. The Declaration of Independence is the founding document of this extraordinary birth of freedom that would help transform the world, inspire the world. Yet the contradiction between the ideals and behavior is found quite dramatically in its author. Thomas Jefferson, on the one hand, authored one of the greatest statements of freedom from servitude, and on the other hand, was utterly dependent on slaves for his economic well-being. His French revolutionary friend, Gilbert de Motier, Marquis of Lafayette, would marvel at how Jefferson could speak at length about freedom amidst the toil of slaves during his extended stays in Monticello. Jefferson's revolutionary ideas went up against his economic, emotional, familial ties to institution, as well as his personality. His economic dependence on a slave was heightened by his constant debt. Much of it was because he was purchasing costly books, including some of those on freedom, as well as maintaining the expensive lifestyle expected of a Virginia gentleman farmer. Even George Washington, sorry Jefferson, I missed you for a bit. Had his servants and other staples of gentleman's lifestyle while leading his starving, frostbitten soldiers at Gettysburg. Jefferson's personality must be taken into consideration, understanding his behavior, and the incredible gap between his ideals and his reality. Bullying by an older boy who lived with him during his formative adolescence left his mark. Aside from impersonal conversations, he moved his colleagues by his literary elegance, not by his squeaky voice. This is why, as president, he sent rather than delivered the State of the Union address to Congress, starting a precedent that would continue until Wilson broke it over 100 years later. He was a very retentive personality, could not easily let go of his valued possessions, including slaves. Familial considerations complicated his relationship with some of his slaves. His beloved wife, Martha, he was extraordinarily devoted to, often refusing to leave home to serve the revolutionary cause. When she was ill, expecting a child, much to the frustration of Washington and his colleagues. Sometime in the course of mourning Martha's death, he found solace in her half-sister, Sally, which resulted in 6 children. Sally was the slave of Martha, would come with her as a 10-year-old with her 18-year-old brother James Hemming, also a son of her father, that is of Martha's father, to Monticello. And so devotion to the sister of his beloved wife, dead wife, resulted in considerable emotional and, of course, a sexual bond. Jefferson was caught between conflicting demands of his position of American politician and his private emotional life, and his universal revolutionary ideals and public political persona. When American historians stopped simply idealizing Jefferson for his enormous achievements, contributions to for the birth and nurturance of the nation and his ideals, they began to acknowledge that he was a man who lived with and had children by his late wife's half-slave sister. Fawn Brody, a UCL pioneer psychohistorian, UCLA that is, an author of Thomas Jefferson, An Intimate History, was totally denounced by the Jefferson establishment for putting into print what had been part of the oral tradition of descendants of Jefferson and finding lots of additional evidence. Our New York psychohistorical colleague, Lee Sneidman, spelled out Jefferson's secretness and duplicity in his book, Leading from Weakness, Jefferson's overt and covert relations with Spain and the Barbary States. Regrettably, Lee died before he could publish, and he never even gave a presentation on the subject to this group, though he did to the Psychohistory Forum. Jefferson's life was complicated by events in Europe. He was thrilled by the French Revolution of 1789 and was very eager to observe it firsthand and serve his country as minister to France. The revolution had renounced slavery, and that fit ideologically with his beliefs, but it complicated his emotional and economic life. He took Sally Hemings and her brother James with him, brother as manservant, and once they landed, these two were legally free. Both debated, should we stay in France? To avert this, Jefferson promised freedom to them after they returned to America. For James, it was after James learned how to cook in the French style and then trained someone else to serve in his place back in Virginia. And James wasn't freed in 1796, but became an alcoholic and committed suicide in 1801 after doing, after having served Jefferson War. Sally would only be informally freed by Jefferson's daughter sometime after his death in 1826. According to one of Sally's children, their children I should say, two Jefferson Hemings children who were 7/8 Caucasian, and their mother were listed in 1833 Virginia County Census as white. Clearly they passed, and those conflicting pictures, one of Sally, reflect different images. I don't think we really have exact images. These are portraits, if my recollection is correct, from accounts of them. And of course, Jefferson wrote incredibly little about Sally. Now, George Washington, whose picture I can't find here, but you know what he looks like, so check out a owned slaves his entire life and did not make pronouncements about any institution, though privately he sort of regretted it. The leader of the war for colonial freedom was quite disturbed when some of his own slaves ran away. During the war, the Brits were promising safety and freedom to any slave who escaped from a rebel master and promised a home for them in Sierra Leone. In his will, Washington provided that his own slaves be freed upon the death of his wife Martha, which in fact they were. Her larger number of slaves were sold after her death, put on the block and sold like cattle. In the early years of the Republic, there was some among the founding fathers who hoped that slavery would die out in the new nation. However, when the Yankee Eli Whitney's invention, of the cotton gin, 1793, cotton became king in the South, and strengthen the slaveocracy. Now, both the American and the French revolutions were outgrowths of the Enlightenment. And the idea that there were universal rights is a central concept of modern man. Professor Lynn Hunt of UCLA, a past president of the American Historical Association and a Clio Psyche featured scholar, discussed this development, Inventing Human Rights, a History. However, it's one thing to proclaim human rights, quite another to both make them a reality and explore their implications. It usually takes a number of generations to explore the implications once a right is actually put into law. The Founding Fathers instituted many rights in the American Constitution while mentioning slavery only in the context of giving more voting power to slave states by counting slaves as 3/5 of a person for electoral purposes. They had proclaimed the Republic with individual rights, but in the minds of most of these Founding Fathers, a democracy would constitute a mobocracy. They couldn't accept this notion, and that wouldn't come to effect until later. As those of us who are psychotherapists who have been in therapy know, change is usually a slow, difficult process within a person. Societal change can sometimes be quite rapid, as in the French Revolution, but change to actually take root is a much more daunting process, a complex process. The abolition of the slavery in the northern states, the number of the enslaved was not great. It was a slow process that involved dealing with vested interest. Most of the Founding Fathers knew that they could not push too hard and fast, which is why they did not attempt to deal with this divisive issue of the abolition of slavery, even though many felt badly about it. Okay. The technology and generational change. Or am I talking too long? Probably I should follow Sheldon Solomon's example and just go directly to questions and answers. How does that work for you? Yeah, okay. So, I won't cover, but you can read if you're doing the part of the symposium on change. This section and the one on childhood and other things that are empathy, inclusion, and childhood, and a lot more. My paper today is an extract from that longer symposium paper. So, what questions do you have? Thank you. Herb.
Well, this topic of slavery reminds me that as a young child, I felt as if I was a slave. In fact, I remember learning the national anthem and it for the home of the free and the land of the land of the brave. Yes, I felt that it didn't apply to me. I was not brave enough to find my parents. So, do you want to comment on an extension from slavery to other people, but with the slavery of children to their parents?
How about of parents to their children? Heck, a lot of hard work to raise kids, and the most important thing I've ever done. What you say reminds me of the quote from Blumenthal's book on Abe Lincoln that just came out, which when Lincoln said in 1856, "I was once a slave," referring to being rented out, in effect, by his father to neighbors, and not getting anything for it himself, to split logs and do other heavy farm work. And I suspect children generally at times feel enslaved. In doing child therapy, trying to think if any ever said that to me, but they certainly had the emotion of being enslaved. I remember throughout most of history, children are there to serve the parents, as Floyd DeMoss pointed out so well in The Evolution of Childhood and some of his early work. Yes?
I have more of a comment, and it also goes about child rearing. And I remember hearing a presentation at NAP probably more than 10 years ago by, I forget the first name, Yuka was the last name, Who's Binding the Children, which was a study of the history of child rearing. And it was interesting because her synopsis was that child rearing is such a laborious process that if you look at history, all different kinds of relationship models were used, but it was usually what was dictated by the economics of the parents, how they could raise children, and that afterwards, after the fact, the local experts of the day, whether they were priests or psychologists or still somebody else, would come in and explain why the present arrangement, which was really dictated by economics, was the very best that could possibly be. So it was really, the theory of child rearing was a rationalization of what had to happen for economic reasons.
That is very often the case to children on the farm or growing up in a family business. I keep thinking of when I was at a nursery once, and this 5-year-old kid was taking such delight in pushing heavy bushes to the back of the truck to help unload them. And I think of my pride and joy in being able to finally be able to sweep my parents' store, my big brother's job. And of course they yelled, "Don't, you're raising dust, Paul, you're raising dust." So there was a lot of, it's a mixed bag. In some ways, much easier to grow up where you saw what your children did right up close, your parents did right up close, and you copied it as children in so many cases. But of course, some wanting to do other things. Abe Lincoln wanted to read books, and so forth. Okay, Floyd.
I was doing some research and writing on the Ukraine-Russia crisis. There was another slave trade, which we don't talk much about, but between 1200 and into the 1700s, more than 2 million Russians and Ukrainians were enslaved by Tatars and Turks, and often sold into Italian slave markets. So there was a whole system of white slavery running in what's now Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean area.
And the Balkans, I cover that. I cover one little aspect of that, but also we go back earlier. The word Slavic is derived from slave because the Byzantines in the Eastern Roman Empire were getting their slaves from from these people who became the Slavic people.
He
To the
used the
north.
expression harvesting the steppe. They would send big raids up into what's Ukraine and Russia and harvest the steppe. They would just collect people and sell them.
Horrendous, or the tax of having to give your children in the Balkans, which is one reason for the extreme Muslim attitudes of so many Serbs, to the Ottoman government, who would then become part of the who would be converted to Islam, part of the Janissaries, the army that would oppress them whenever they were rebelling, or be castrated and become actually in some cases the equivalent of the prime minister of the Sultan. So there's an awful lot of that goes on Eastern Europe. Most of what we say about Europe, we really mean Western Europe. And depends on time period, and more specifically, it's typically England and France, Low Countries, Northern Italy. Other questions? Yes?
Yes. Getting back to Tom Jefferson, he also had not only a French friend, Lafayette, who happened to be a Freemason. Jefferson was not. He also had a Polish friend. His name was Thaddeus Kosciuszko, one of my favorite bridges in Brooklyn, going under construction now. Anyway, Kosciuszko, which is another way to pronounce his name, he was a rebel. He liked the Freemason ideas of tolerance and the idea of equality and brotherhood, and he came here to fight. And he also happened to be an engineer and did a lot of things with West Point. But he also was a good friend of Tom Jefferson. He was invited to visit him in Monticello. And anyway, he didn't like the idea that Tom Jefferson had slaves. And he told him in a letter that if you guys don't, do something about this problem, it's gonna be a big problem. And he also left money for a black school in case they decide to get rid of slavery. The slaves would be able to get an education. And he kept writing Jefferson during hard times in Europe, especially in Poland, because he was trying to lead a revolution over there, didn't succeed.
Yeah.
But he wanted to know what happened to the money that he left. Well, Jefferson kind of ignored it. Either way, Thaddeus Kosciuszko should be mentioned as one of those rebels who didn't like the idea of slavery.
There's an incredible literature on Jefferson, and of course he invented a machine to copy any letter he sent because he wanted evidence of it, which is how part of what Lee Snyderman used, using these records to show the extent of his duplicity between his public statements and his private statements. He did have enormous problems. Callender, who had worked a little bit for Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, as they were then called, had turned on Jefferson. It was well known because you just had to take a look at the Hemings children to see that they had this Southern family resemblance here. So that was clearly a factor. I think emotionally Jefferson was extremely connected to Sally, and I suspect she was to him. Certainly, he was the father of her four surviving children who died as infants. Other questions? Yes, Ken?
If your subject is how society's changed, and the sub-subject part of that is in relationship to slavery, is there a reason why you didn't talk as much about the abolition of slavery in some of the northern states by the time the Constitution was adopted in the Arctic and the Northwest Territory Law, and more about when the anti-slavery movement was politically prominent in the North?
Time and, of course, lack of knowledge, because it's complex. You have to go state by state. I know in New Jersey, it wasn't till the beginning of the 19th century where they formally abolished slavery, provided, a slave child would no longer be a slave, would be free, because you have to provide for vested interest to a degree. And I think it was not long before the Civil War when the last New Jersey slave had died. Politicians deal with vested interest, and it's complex. And I know it varies from state to state in the northern colonies, and of course, at some points there were a lot of slaves, especially in Pennsylvania, and of course, Delaware and Maryland we think of them northern now, but they're below the Mason-Dixon line. Yes.
I would think that to focus on change, or the dynamic of change is very important, because one cultural phenomenon is change. And in our lives, it changes several times. In earlier times, it's much slower. One king can go away, next king coming, and the Pope is eternal. And so maybe there is a connection to the denial of death, or the anxiety of death. Change means dying of the old, coming to a new frame. And this is a very difficult process. I think it is a broad field, and it is very important that, and maybe it's a chance for us, of psychohistorians, to understand more the dynamics of change, because the problems of the Arabic world and in the global world are problems of change. How can we manage change? Not by wars or restaging fetal traumas and so on, and how we can manage change by negotiations and so on. And why is this so difficult?
Well, it is in part because what you've internalized is now being threatened by the change. And very difficult. And the rapidity of change in the section that I chose not to go into among the younger generation is enormous, just extraordinarily rapid. And now, and change is spreading with lightning speed throughout the world. And this is very threatening. And so easy to blame the other, which you have. As far as combining the denial of death with the subject, I'd love to get someone who has written a paper on the subject to sit around for a typical psychohistory forum meeting where people read the paper ahead of time, and in a group of, I don't know, 12 to 20, however many people show up that day, the person doesn't talk for more than 15 or 20 minutes, and then we spend the rest of the time discussing the issue, looking for the implications, developing them, because you can work in much greater depth that way. Floyd had another question.
The issue of the lack, like what is the popular psychology of why the United States still has a lack of acknowledgement of slavery? For example,
Acknowledgement of what?
slavery, the
Yeah.
institution of slavery. We have a museum to the Holocaust. Canada is right now building a museum to the victims of communism. But the victims of slavery, I know there's a couple of states that made slave museums, but still as a nation, we don't have the full acknowledgement of what was slavery in terms of museums, that kind of display in our history. So we have Jefferson Memorial. We have these monuments still to these people. But we have no institutional memory and memorialization in stone of what was this slavery business.
I think there are a number of reasons. We're just beginning to really delve into accepting African Americans as equals. You see the incredible ambivalence. Dave Bizel wrote a brilliant article before Obama came into office about all the fantasies, how because he was different, that he would be able to change society, and the conservatives said, no way will we cooperate with this man, and but the broader, it's very difficult. It's difficult for a lot of Americans to have a biracial president, even if he was raised by white grandparents and white mother, and only chose to adopt the black identity when he was off in college in Southern California. But it's an enormous kettle of worms in terms of reparations that the people don't want to open that can of worms, but yet we're struggling with being politically correct. I think a lot of Trump's support is based on people being tired of being PC, especially having to do with African Americans and so many other issues. Why can't you just hate people in the good old way? Is what a lot of people yearn for. Thank you very much.
There was an article in Atlantic Magazine on pro-white statements about your author on reparations, the need for reparations, and there was a comprehensive article. It came out a few months ago.
There's another one on in the Atlantic by Dan, his last name is escaping me, one of the, who does presidential traits and psychological traits, that has some good material, but it messes up. It's I think it's like 2 weeks ago. Going into what sort of president would Trump be. But that's for tomorrow. If I have
We have time for
voice,
one more question.
otherwise Ken will,
Yeah.
tomorrow will read my paper on.
Yes, I will.
Comparing,
We'll take one more.
comparing Hillary and Donald.
We'll take one more question. Yeah.
Just take 2 minutes to talk a little bit about the history of psychohistory, because I love this organization, and it's the general population is my age, you know, and I'm wondering how can we get more people interested in psychohistory?
I've only been working on that for a half century. There's a Cambridge University Press book on psychology and history where I have a chapter that has a lot of that history, as the field goes back to discussions in the Freud circle, and then Americans quickly picked up on it, and some of in Clear Psyche, I've got some articles on those early in the 19-teens, Americans who were doing psychohistory of Luther and of other people. It's a long, rich history of an organized field. The first psychohistory groups don't start till Wellfleet with Lifton in 1964 approximately. And I'm hoping Robert J. Lifton will live forever and Wellfleet will keep going. Even though they don't formally call themselves a psychohistory group, they do a brand of it. It's a rich field that hasn't been embraced by academia, but when people need certain insights, they come to our literature, which is vast, and sometimes to our organizations. Thank you very much.